Racist woman calls 911 on black homeless veteran. What they do next shocks her. A racist confrontation in a peaceful suburban park spirals out of control when a privileged woman calls the police on a homeless black veteran, but as their paths unexpectedly intertwine, a shocking twist transforms both their lives forever. What extraordinary events unfolded that day to bridge the gap between prejudice and compassion? Before we dive into this incredible story, comment below wherein the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this heartwarming tale of redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Karen Thompson strode purposefully through Oakwood Park, her designer sneakers crunching on the gravel path. At 45, she carried herself with the air of someone who believed the world revolved around her. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and meticulously applied makeup were a stark contrast to the natural beauty of the park around her. Little did Karen know her actions that morning would set in motion as chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and the world around her. As she rounded a bend in the path, Karen's piercing blue eyes narrowed at the sight before her. There on her favorite bench, the one with the best view of the duck pond, lay a man. His weathered face was partially hidden by a worn baseball cap, and his clothes were threadbare and dirty. But what caught Karen's attention most was the color of his skin. Karen's lips curled into a sneer as she approached the sleeping figure. In her mind, this was her park, her sanctuary, away from the riff-raff that she believed was encroaching on her perfect suburban life. And this man, this homeless black man, was ruining it all with his mere presence. "Excuse me," Karen said sharply, her voice dripping with disdain. "You can't sleep here. This is a respectable neighborhood park, not a flop house." The man on the bench stirred slowly, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. As he focused on Karen, she took an involuntary step back, her hand clutching her designer purse a little tighter. "I'm sorry, Mom," the man said softly, his voice growly from sleep. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I'll move along." But Karen wasn't satisfied with his compliance. The sight of this man, disheveled and clearly down on his luck, stirred something ugly within her. It brought back memories of her own struggles, of the times when she felt like she was losing control of her life. But instead of empathy, these memories only fueled her anger and resentment. "You better move along," she snapped. "People like you don't belong here. You're making the place unsafe for decent folks." The man's shoulders slumped at her words, but he didn't argue. He'd heard it all before. As he slowly gathered his meager belongings, Karen pulled out her phone, her fingers flying over the screen as she dialed 91W. "Yes, hello? I need to report a suspicious person in Oakwood Park," she said, her voice laden with exaggerated fear. "There's a homeless man here, and he's acting aggressively. I don't feel safe. Please send someone quickly." As Karen spoke, she failed to notice the curious and disapproving glances from other park-goers. An elderly man feeding the ducks shook his head sadly, while a young mother out for a jog with her baby slowed down, concern etched on her face. The man on the bench, David Miller, listened to Karen's false report with a mixture of resignation and disbelief. At 58, he'd seen more than his fair share of prejudice and hardship. After serving his country for over 2 decades, he'd returned home to find a world that had moved on without him. PTSD and a string of bad luck had left him homeless, struggling to navigate a system that seemed designed to fail those who needed it most. As Karen continued her trade, embellishing her story with each passing moment, John's mind drifted back to happier times. He remembered the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers, the sense of purpose that came with serving his country. But those memories were tainted by the horrors he'd witnessed, the friends he'd lost, and the pieces of himself he'd left behind on foreign soil. Little did Karen know her actions that morning would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and the world around her. The sound of sirens in the distance snapped John back to the present. He sighed heavily, knowing what was coming. He'd been through this routine before. The suspicious looks, the invasive questions, the assumption of guilt based solely on his appearance and the color of his skin. As 2 police cruisers pulled up to the park entrance, Karen's face lit up with smug satisfaction. She straightened her designer workout jacket and placed on a look of distress, ready to play the part of the damsel in danger. Officer Daniel Rivera was the first to approach his partner, Officer Emily Scott, close Behind with over 15 years on the force, Rivera had seen his fair share of frivolous calls, and something about this situation didn't sit right with him. "Good morning, ma'am," Officer Rivera said, his tone professional but cautious. "I understand you called about a suspicious person." Karen launched into her tale, her voice quivering with manufactured fear. "Yes, officer, this man was sleeping on the bench, and when I asked him to leave he became aggressive. I feared for my safety." Officer Rivera turned his attention to John, who had remained seated on the bench, his hands clearly visible on his lap. There was something in the man's demeanor, a quiet dignity, despite his circumstances, that struck a chord with the officer. "Sir, can I ask your name?" Officer Rivera inquired, his tone notably softer than when he had addressed Karen. "David Miller, sir." David replied, his voice steady. "I apologize for any disturbance. I'll be on my way." As David spoke, Officer Rivera noticed something, a slight hesitation before speaking, a certain set to his shoulders. It was a demeanor he recognized from his own time in the service. "Mr. Miller, if you don't mind me asking, did you serve?" John's eyes met the officer's, a flicker of surprise crossing his weathered features. "Yes, sir, 23 years. Marines." Officer Rivera nodded, a look of understanding passing between the two men. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Miller." "I served as well, Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan." And Karen, who had been watching this exchange with growing impatience, suddenly interjected, "Excuse me, but what does that have to do with anything? This man is trespassing and making the park unsafe. I demand that you remove him immediately." Officer Rivera turned back to Karen, his expression hardening slightly. "Ma'am, Mr. Miller hasn't committed any crime. Being homeless is not illegal, and he has as much right to be in this public park as anyone else." Karen's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. This wasn't going the way she had planned. She pulled out her phone again, this time to start recording. "I can't believe this. I'm going to report this to your superiors. You're refusing to protect tax-paying citizens from vagrants." As Karen's voice rose, attracting attention from other park-goers, Officer Thompson stepped in. "Ma'am, please lower your voice. We're not refusing to do anything. We're assessing the situation, which is our job." Meanwhile, Officer Rivera had moved closer to Jan, speaking to him in low tones. "Mr. Miller, have you been in contact with the VA? There are programs available for veterans in need of housing assistance." David nodded wearily. "I've tried, sir, but the waiting lists are long. And the paperwork, it's overwhelming sometimes, especially with my PTSD acting up." Officer Rivera's face softened with sympathy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. "I understand. Look, I know someone at the local veterans center. His name is Dave Martinez. He's good at cutting through red tape. Give him a call. Tell him Mike Rivera sent you." As this conversation was taking place, Karen's frustration had reached a boiling point. She marched over, phone held high, still recording. "This is unacceptable. I'm a taxpayer. I have rights. This man is a threat to our community, and you're treating him like he belongs here." Officer Thompson stepped between Karen and the two men. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. You're escalating this situation unnecessarily." But Karen was beyond reason now. Months of pent-up frustration, fear, and prejudice came pouring out in a torrent of hateful words. "You people are all the same, protecting criminals and degenerates, while hardworking Americans suffer. I'll have both your badges for this." As Karen's rant continued, she failed to notice that several bystanders had begun recording the incident on their phones. Her face contorted with rage, and her venomous words were being captured for all the world to see. Officer Rivera, having finished his conversation with John, turned back to Karen. His voice was firm but controlled. "Mom, I'm going to ask you one last time to calm down. You called us here under false pretenses, claiming Mr. Miller was being aggressive when he clearly was not. Making false reports to the police is a serious offense." Karen's eyes widened in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. She was the victim here, wasn't she? In her mind, she was protecting her community, standing up for what was right. How could these officers not see that? As the confrontation reached its peak, none of the participants realized that this incident would soon explode across social media, igniting in a firestorm of controversy and forcing a community to confront its deep-seated prejudices. Karen, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment, stormed away from the scene, her phone clutched tightly in her manicured hand. She was already composing the social media post in her mind, certain that once she shared her side of the story, everyone would rally to her defense as she left Officer Rivera. Turn back to Jan. Mr. Miller, is there somewhere you can go for now? I'd feel better knowing you had a safe place to rest. David nodded slowly. There's a shelter across town. It's not much, but they know me. There, Officer Rivera reached into his wallet and pulled out a $20 bill. Here for bus fare and maybe a hot meal, and don't forget to call that number I gave you. John's eyes welled up with unexpected tears. It had been a long time since anyone had shown him such kindness. Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say. As John gathered his few belongings and headed out of the park, neither he nor Officer Rivera could have predicted how their lives would become intertwined in the days to come. Later that evening, Karen sat at her kitchen table, a glass of white wine in hand, as she furiously typed out her account of the morning's events on Facebook. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, each word dripping with self-righteousness and indignation. Shocked and appalled by the state of our community, this morning I encountered a dangerous vagrant in our beautiful Oakwood Park. When I called the police for help, they refused to do their job. Is this what we pay our taxes for, to be left vulnerable to criminals and degenerates? We must take back our parks and streets. She attached the video she had taken, carefully edited to show only the parts that supported her version of events. With a satisfied smirk, she hit post and sat back, waiting for the likes and supportive comments to roll in. But Karen had grossly miscalculated. Within hours, her post had indeed gone viral, but not in the way she had anticipated. Other videos of the incident taken by bystanders began to surface. These unedited versions painted a very different picture, one of a privileged woman harassing a homeless veteran and making false claims to the police. The backlash was swift and severe. Karen's Facebook page was flooded with angry comments. People she had considered friends were publicly distancing themselves from her. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, each one a fresh barrage of criticism and outrage. As the night wore on, Karen's smug certainty began to crumble. She had always seen herself as a pillar of the community, someone who stood up for what was right, but now faced with the harsh light of public scrutiny, she was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Maybe she wasn't the hero of this story. Meanwhile, across town, in a crowded homeless shelter, John lay on a narrow cot, the business card from Officer Rivera clutched in his hand. As he drifted off to sleep, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, tomorrow might bring a change in his fortunes. What neither Karen nor David realized was that their paths would cross again in ways they could never have imagined. The events set in motion that morning in Oakwood Park were far from over, and the biggest challenges and opportunities for growth were yet to come. As dawn broke over the city, Karen awoke to a world that had dramatically shifted overnight. Her phone, which she had finally silenced in the early hours of the morning, was filled with missed calls, text messages, and a barrage of social media notifications. With a growing sense of dread, she began to scroll through them. The local news had picked up the story. Her face was plastered across the screen alongside headlines like "Local Woman Ars Homeless Veteran and Racism in the Park." Community outraged, Karen felt her stomach churn as she watched clips of herself, her face contorted with anger, spewing words she now deeply regretted. As she prepared for work, Karen's phone rang. It was her boss, Karen. He said, his voice tight, with barely contained anger, "We need to talk. Come to my office as soon as you get." In the drive to work was a blur of anxiety and shame. Karen, usually so confident and self-assured, felt exposed and vulnerable as she walked through the office. She could feel the stares of her coworkers, could hear the whispers that fell silent as she passed in her boss's office. The reality of her situation came crashing down. "Karen," he said, his disappointment palpable, "your actions have brought significant negative attention to this company. We pride ourselves on being an inclusive workplace, and your behavior is in direct conflict with our values. I'm afraid we're going to have to let you go." Karen left the office in a daze, a cardboard box of her belongings clutched to her chest. In the span of 24 hours, her entire world had been turned upside down. As she sat in her car in the parking lot, tears streaming down her face, Karen was forced to confront the consequences of her actions in a way she never had before. Across town, David's day was taking a very different turn. He had called the number Officer Rivera had given him, and to his surprise, he was given an appointment that very Morning, as he walked into the Veteran Center, he was greeted warmly by Dave Martinez, the man Officer Rivera had mentioned. David Miller, Dave said, extending his hand. Mike told me about you. Let's see what we can do to get you back on your feet. Over the next few hours, Joan found himself swept up in a whirlwind of activity. Dave helped him navigate the complex paperwork for housing assistance, connected him with a PTSD support group, and even found him a spot in a job training program. As David left the center that afternoon, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. The path ahead was still long and challenging, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a fighting chance. Little did John know that his path would soon cross again with the woman who had caused him so much trouble just a day before. The intertwining of their stories was far from over, and the most unexpected twists were yet to come. A week had passed since the incident in the park, and Karen's life had become almost unrecognizable. She had lost her job, many of her friends had cut ties with her, and she could barely leave her house without feeling the weight of judgmental stares from her neighbors as she sat at her kitchen table scrolling through job listings on her laptop. Karen felt a deep sense of loneliness and regret. The anger that had fueled her actions in the park had long since faded, replaced by a knowing sense of shame and a desperate desire to make things right. With a heavy sigh, Karen closed her laptop and decided to take a walk. She needed to clear her head to escape the suffocating atmosphere of her home. Without really thinking about it, her feet carried her to Oakwood Park. As she approached the entrance, Karen hesitated. This was where it had all started. Part of her wanted to turn back, to hide away from the world that now seemed so hostile, but something pushed her forward, a need to confront her mistakes. Hidden. The park was quiet in the late afternoon light. As Karen walked along the familiar paths, she found herself approaching the bench where she had encountered John. To her surprise, he was there again, sitting quietly and looking out over the pond. Karen's heart raced. Her first instinct was to turn and flee, but she fought against it, taking a deep breath. She approached the bench. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice a far cry from the harsh tones she had used a week ago. "Mr. Miller." John looked up, his eyes widening in recognition. He tensed visibly, clearly uncomfortable with her presence. I owe you an apology," Karen continued, her voice trembling slightly. "What I did last week was inexcusable. I treated you horribly, and I'm truly sorry." David regarded her silently for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Karen stood there, feeling exposed and vulnerable, waiting for a response that seemed like it might never come. Finally, David spoke, his voice low and measured. "Why are you really here, ma'am? Is it because you're genuinely sorry, or because your life has fallen apart?" Karen flinched at his words, but she couldn't deny the truth in them. She slowly sat down on the far end of the bench, leaving plenty of space between them. "You're right to question my motives," she admitted. "The truth is, I'm here for both reasons. Yes, my life has been turned upside down, and yes, that's part of why I'm here, but it's also made me take a hard look at myself, at my actions and beliefs, and I don't like what I see." Jayan listened quietly, his gaze now fixed on the pond before them. Karen continued, the words pouring out of her in a rush. "I've spent so much of my life judging others, thinking I was better than everyone else, but this past week has shown me how wrong I was. I've lost my job, my friends, but more than that, I've lost respect for myself. I know an apology doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to know that I regret what I did, and I'm trying to be better." As Karen finished speaking, she realized tears were streaming down her face. She wiped them away hastily. Embarrassed by her display of emotion, Jayan remained silent for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but firm. "I appreciate your apology, Momum, but you're right, it doesn't fix anything. Words are easy, it's actions that matter." Karen nodded, a lump in her throat. "I understand. I don't expect forgiveness. I needed to say it." As she stood to leave, John's voice stopped her. "Mrs. Thompson," Karen supplied. "Karen Thompson." David nodded. "Mrs. Thompson, I can't say I forgive you, not yet, but I believe in second chances. The fact that you're here, that you're trying to make amends, that counts for something." Karen felt a glimmer of hope at his words. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. I promise I'm going to do better." As Karen walked away, she felt a mix of emotions: shame for her past actions relief at having taken the first step towards making amends, and a determination to follow through on her promise to do better. Little did Karen know this conversation was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge her in ways she never expected and lead to a most unlikely friendship. Over the next few weeks, Karen threw herself into volunteer work, desperate to make a positive impact on her community. She started at a local super kitchen, chopping vegetables and serving meals to those in need. The work was hard and often thankless, but Karen found a sense of purpose in it that she had never experienced in her corporate job. One afternoon, as Karen was clearing tables after the lunch rush, she looked up to see a familiar face entering the soup kitchen. It was David, accompanied by Dave Martinez from the Veteran Center. Karen froze, unsure of how to react. Dave spotted her and waved her over. Karen, right, I've heard about you. Come meet David properly. Karen approached nervously, wiping her hands on her apron. Hello, Mr. Miller, it's good to see you again. David nodded, a hint of a smile on his face. Mrs. Thompson, Dave tells me you've been volunteering here for a while now. Yes, Karen replied, surprised by the lack of hostility in John's tone. I'm trying to give back to the community to make up for my past behavior. Dave looked between them, sensing the history. Well, David here has been making great progress. He's in a transitional housing program now, and he's starting a job training course next week. We thought he might want to give back a little too, so we're here to see about volunteer opportunities. Karen's face lit up. That's wonderful news, Mr. Miller. I'm so glad things are looking up for you. JK's expression softened slightly. Thank you, it's been a long road, but I'm getting there. As Dave went to speak with the volunteer coordinator, Karen and JN found themselves alone. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Karen spoke. Mr. Miller, I know I've said this before, but I truly am sorry for how I treated you. I was wrong, and I'm working every day to be a better person. John studied her for a moment before responding. I can see that, Mrs. Thompson. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong and to try to change. I respect that. Karen felt a weight lift from her shoulders at his words. Thank you, that means a lot coming from you. As Dave returned with information about volunteer opportunities, Karen had an idea. Mr. Miller, if you're interested, I could show you the ropes here. It can be a bit overwhelming at first, but it's really rewarding work. John hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I'd appreciate that, Mrs. Thompson. Thank you. And so began an unlikely partnership. Over the next few weeks, Karen and David worked side by side at the soup kitchen. At first, their interactions were stilted and awkward, both hyper-aware of their past conflict, but as time went on, they found a rhythm in their work, and a cautious friendship began to form. Karen learned about John's experiences in the military, the struggles he faced upon returning home, and the challenges of living on the streets. David, in turn, saw a different side of Karen, one that was humble, hardworking, and genuinely committed to change. One evening, as they were closing up the kitchen, David turned to Karen. You know, Mrs. Thompson, when I first met you in that park, I never would have imagined we'd end up here. Karen chuckled softly. Me neither, Mr. Miller, and please call me Karen. David smiled. Then I insist you call me David. As they walked out into the cool evening air, Karen felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She knew she still had a long way to go, that one good deed didn't erase a lifetime of prejudice, but she was on the right path, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly proud of herself. Little did Karen and David know, their budding friendship was about to face its greatest test, yet the coming weeks would challenge them both in ways they never expected, forcing them to confront their deepest fears and prejudices. But through it all, they would discover the transformative power of empathy, forgiveness, and second chances. As summer turned to fall, Karen and John's unlikely friendship continued to grow. They volunteered together regularly at the soup kitchen and occasionally met for coffee to chat about their lives. Karen had found a new job, though at a much lower position than her previous one, and was slowly rebuilding her life. John was excelling in his job training program and had moved into more permanent housing. One crisp October morning, Karen arrived at the park for her usual morning walk. As she approached the bench where she had first encountered John, she was surprised to see him sitting there, his head in his hands. David, she called out, concern evident in her voice. Is everything all right? David looked up, and Karen was shocked to see tears in his eyes. Karen, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I Don't know what to do, Karen sat down beside him, all thoughts of her walk forgotten. What's happened? David took a deep breath before speaking. I got a call from my daughter last night, my ex-wife. She's sick, cancer. It's bad, and she doesn't have much time left. He paused, swallowing hard. My daughter asked if I could come home to help out and to say goodbye. Karen felt her heart ache for her friend. Oh, David, I'm so sorry. Of course you should go. David shook his head, frustration evident in his gesture. It's not that simple there in California. I can't afford the trip, and even if I could. Karen, I haven't seen my family in years, not since he trailed off. But Karen understood, not since he had become homeless. Without hesitation, Karen placed her hand on John's arm. David, listen to me. You need to be with your family. Right now, we'll figure out the rest. Over the next few days, Karen threw herself into helping John prepare for his trip. She reached out to her contacts, managing to secure a discounted plane ticket. She helped John navigate the process of taking a leave of absence from his job training program, assuring him that his spot would be waiting for him when he returned the morning of David's flight. Karen drove him to the airport. As they stood at the security checkpoint, John turned to her, his eyes filled with gratitude. Karen, I don't know how to thank you for all of this, he said softly. Karen shook her head, smiling. You don't need to thank me, David. This is what friends do for each other. As John disappeared into the security line, Karen felt a mix of emotions wash over her: pride in how far they had both come, worry for John and his family, and a strange sense of loss at the thought of not seeing him for several weeks. Little did Karen know David's trip would set in motion a series of events that would test their friendship in ways they never could have anticipated. In the weeks that followed, Karen threw herself into her volunteer work, trying to fill the void left by John's absence. She found herself missing their conversations, the easy camaraderie they had developed. She worried about how he was coping with his ex-wife's illness and the reunion with his estranged family. One evening, as Karen was leaving the soup kitchen, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. And did you hear about that homeless vet who scammed that lady? One volunteer was saying to another. Apparently, he made up some sob story about a sick ex-wife to get her to pay for a trip to California. Now he's disappeared with the money. Karen felt her heart drop. She wanted to believe it wasn't true, that they couldn't be talking about John, but the details matched too closely for comfort. Over the next few days, Karen tried repeatedly to reach John, but her calls went straight to voicemail. She contacted Dave at the Veteran Center, only to learn that John hadn't been in touch with them either. Doubt began to creep into her mind. Had she been fooled? Had her desire to make amends blinded her to the truth? As the days turned into weeks with no word from JN, Karen found herself struggling with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to believe in John and the friendship they had built, but another part, the part that had been shaped by years of prejudice and mistrust, whispered that she had been naive, that John had taken advantage of her guilt. The situation came to a head when a local news station picked up the story. They ran a piece about a con man preying on the guilty consciences of well-meaning citizens, featuring an interview with a woman who claimed to have been scammed by JN. Karen watched the broadcast with a growing sense of horror. The woman's story was eerily similar to her own. She had met John in a park, felt guilty about her initial prejudice, and had been persuaded to help him financially. Now, like Karen, she hadn't heard from him in weeks. As the anchor asked viewers to come forward with any information about John's whereabouts, Karen felt her world crumbling around her. Had everything, the friendship, the personal growth, the sense of redemption, been a lie? With a heavy heart, Karen picked up her phone and dialed the number for the news station. As much as it pained her, she felt she had a responsibility to share what she knew. But just as she was about to hit the call button, her phone lit up with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, with a California area code. With trembling fingers, Karen answered. Hello, Karen. The voice on the other end was familiar, but strained. It's David. I'm so sorry I haven't been in touch. Things have been complicated. Karen felt a wave of relief wash over her, quickly followed by a surge of anger and confusion. David, where have you been? Do you have any idea what's been happening here? There was a pause on the other end of the line when Joan spoke again. His voice was heavy with exhaustion and emotion. Karen, I can explain everything, but I need your help. Can you come to California? Karen's mind reeled. Part of her wanted to refuse to protect herself from potentially being hurt again, but another part, the part that had grown and changed over the past months, urged her to listen, to give John a chance to explain all. Right, David, she said, finally I'll come, but when I get there you better have one hell of an explanation. As Karen hung up the phone, she knew she was at a crossroads. Her decision to go to California could either validate her newfound faith in humanity or confirm her worst fears about being manipulated. Either way, she knew that the trip would change everything. What Karen didn't realize was that her journey to California would not only resolve the mystery of John's disappearance, but would also force her to confront the deepest roots of her own prejudices and fears. The true test of their friendship and of Karen's personal growth was yet to come. Karen's mind was a whirlwind of emotions as she boarded the plane to California. Doubt, hope, anger, and concern battled for dominance as she replayed her brief conversation with John over and over in her head. The flight seemed interminable, each minute stretching out. As Karen's anxiety grew, finally the plane touched down in Los Angeles. As Karen made her way through the bustling airport, she spotted a familiar face in the crowd. John stood near the exit, looking haggard and worn. When their eyes met, a complex mix of emotions passed between them. Karen, David, said, his voice rough with fatigue. Thank you for coming. I know I have a lot of explaining to do. Karen nodded, her expression guarded. Yes, you do. Let's go somewhere we can talk. They made their way to a small cafe near the airport. As they settled into a quiet corner booth, Karen couldn't help but notice how much older Jan looked, as if he had aged years in the weeks since she'd last seen him. All right, David, Karen said, her voice firm but not unkind. What's going on? Do you have any idea what people are saying back home? John's shoulders slumped as he nodded. I've heard, Karen, I swear to you, none of it is true. I haven't scammed anyone. The situation here, it's been more complicated than I could have imagined. Over the next hour, David poured out the whole story. His ex-wife's condition had been worse than expected. She had no insurance, and the medical bills were astronomical. John's daughter, struggling to cope with her mother's illness and the sudden reappearance of the father she barely knew, had lashed out in anger and confusion. I wanted to call you to explain, John said, his eyes pleading for understanding, but everything was happening so fast, and then my phone was stolen at the hospital, and I couldn't remember your number. As John spoke, Karen felt her anger and doubt slowly melting away, replaced by a deep sense of empathy. Why, she reached across the table, taking JK's hand in hers. Oh, David, she said softly, I'm so sorry you've been going through all this alone, but why didn't you reach out to Dave or someone else for help? John's eyes filled with tears. I was ashed, he admitted. I felt like I was failing all over again, like I couldn't even handle this one thing on my own. And then when I heard about the rumors back home, I was afraid no one would believe me. Karen felt a pang of guilt, remembering her own moments of doubt. I understand, she said, but David, you're not alone, not anymore. Now tell me how I can help. Over the next few days, Karen threw herself into helping John navigate the complex web of medical bills, insurance claims, and family dynamics. She used her professional skills to organize fundraisers, negotiate with the hospital, and even mediate conversations between John and his daughter. As they worked together, Karen found herself in awe of John's resilience and compassion. Despite everything he had been through, he remained focused on being there for his ex-wife and rebuilding his relationship with his daughter. One evening, as they sat in the hospital waiting room during a particularly long night, Joan turned to Karen with a look of wonder. You know, he said softly, a few months ago, I never would have imagined that the woman who called the cops on me in the park would end up being my strongest supporter. Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it? Karen felt tears welling up in her eyes. David, I can never apologize enough for how I treated you that day, but I'm grateful for the chance to make it right, to be a true friend. As they sat there in the sterile hospital hallway, Karen realized how far they had both come, she from a place of prejudice and entitlement to one of empathy and genuine care, and David from isolation and despair to having a support system he could rely on. Their journey was far from over. David's ex-wife was still gravely ill, and there were many challenges ahead, but as they sat there together, Karen knew that whatever came next, they would face it as friends, united by a bond forged through adversity and mutual growth. The next few weeks were a blur of hospital visits, legal consultations, and emotional conversations. Karen extended stay in California, using her vacation days to support John and his family. She watched with pride as John reconnected with his daughter, slowly rebuilding the trust that had been broken years ago. And one afternoon, as they were leaving the hospital after a particularly difficult day, John's daughter, Sarah, pulled Karen aside. "I want to thank you," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion, "for being here for my dad, for all of us. I didn't trust him when he first came back, but seeing how you've stood by him, it's helped me see the man he's become." Karen felt a lump in her throat. "Your father is an incredible man, Sarah. I'm just glad I got the chance to know him to make up for my past mistakes." As the days passed, John's ex-wife's conditions stabilized enough for her to be moved to a hospice facility. The atmosphere was heavy with the knowledge that their time together was limited, but there was also a sense of peace, of wounds being healed and forgiveness being offered on their last night in California. Before flying back home, Karen and David took a walk along the beach. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. "Jan said, stopping to face her, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. You've helped me reconnect with my family, face my past, and find strength I didn't know I had." Karen shook her head, smiling through tears. "Years, David, you don't need to thank me. You've given me so much more. You've taught me about resilience, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. Our friendship, it's changed my life." As they stood there, the waves lapping at their feet, both Karen and David reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment, from a confrontation in a park sparked by prejudice and fear to a deep friendship built on understanding and mutual respect. The flight home was filled with a mixture of emotions: sadness at leaving John's family, concern for his ex-wife's declining health, but also hope for the future and the knowledge that they had each other's support. As they landed and made their way through the airport, Karen suddenly remembered the news story that had aired about Jane. "Oh no," she gasped. "David, what are we going to do about the rumors? People think you're a con man." John squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Weck, face it together, Karen. The truth is on our side." Over the next few days, Karen and David worked tirelessly to clear John's name. They reached out to the news station that had run the story, providing evidence of John's whereabouts and the real reason for his extended absence. They spoke with the Veteran Center, explaining the situation and enlisting their help in spreading the truth. It wasn't easy. Some people were quick to believe the worst, clinging to their prejudices and suspicions, but slowly, as the story came to light, the tide of public opinion began to turn. The woman who had claimed to be scammed by David came forward to admit that she had jumped to conclusions, apologizing for her role in spreading false information. The news station ran a follow-up story highlighting John's dedication to his family and Karen's unwavering support. As the truth spread, Karen and Joan found themselves at the center of a different kind of attention. People were touched by their story of unlikely friendship and personal growth. They were invited to speak at community events, sharing their experiences and the lessons they had learned about overcoming prejudice and the power of second chances. One evening, as they left a speaking engagement at a local church, an elderly woman approached them, tears in her eyes. "Are your story," she said, clasping their hands. "It's given me hope that people can change, that we can overcome our differences and find common ground. Thank you for sharing it with us." Karen and David exchanged a glance, both feeling the weight of the impact their journey had made. They had started as strangers, divided by prejudice and misunderstanding. Now they stood side by side, united in their mission to spread a message of empathy, forgiveness, and the transformative power of friendship. As they walked home that night, Karen turned to David. "You know, when I called the police on you that day in the park, I thought I was protecting my community. I never could have imagined that you would end up being the one to teach me what community really means." David nodded, a soft smile on his face. "And I never thought the woman who saw me as a threat would become my closest friend and strongest advocate." Life has a funny way of working out. Sometimes their story didn't end there. Of course, life continued to throw challenges their way. John's ex-wife passed away a few months later, and Karen was there to support him and Sarah. Through their grief together, they established a foundation in her memory dedicated to helping homeless veterans reintegrate into society. Karen continued her journey of personal growth, using her experiences to become an advocate for social justice and community outreach. David, with Karen's Encouragement pursued his dream of becoming a counselor for veterans struggling with PTSD and homelessness. Their friendship remained a cornerstone in both their lives, a constant reminder of the power of looking beyond first impressions and the importance of giving people second chances years later. As they sat on that same park bench where their story had begun, Karen and David reflected on how far they had come. The park around them had changed, as had they, but the bench remained the same, a symbol of their journey. You know, David, Karen said, her voice soft with emotion, I used to think this bench was mine, that I had some sort of claim to it. Now I realize it belongs to everyone, just like this park, just like our community. We're all in this together. David nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, and that's the most important lesson of all, isn't it? That we're all human, all deserving of kindness and understanding, no matter where we come from or what we look like. And so, dear viewers, as we come to the end of this incredible journey, we're left with a powerful message. It's a reminder that change is possible, that redemption is within reach, and that the bonds of friendship can transcend even the deepest divides. If you were in Karen's position, would you have found the courage to apologize and make amends? Or, if you were David, could you have forgiven someone who initially treated you so poorly? Yes or no? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear your perspective. Thank you for joining us on this transformative journey. If this story touched your heart as much as it did ours, I've handpicked another inspiring tale that I know you'll love. Please don't miss it. Click here to watch it now. Disclaimer: this channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.